When the black maid sat at the piano, everyone went silent. The grand chandelier of the Kensington estate spilled golden light across marble floors, where men in tailored suits and women in gowns glittering with jewels glided effortlessly through the ballroom. The evening had been planned with meticulous perfection, a fundraiser that blended old money tradition with modern elegance. Every corner of the hall echoed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the faint strains of an orchestra playing in the background. At the edge of the spectacle, nearly invisible to those she served, stood Amara, a young black maid in a crisp uniform. Her posture was careful, her steps measured, her presence reduced to what the wealthy considered nothing more than background noise. She had grown used to the dismissive glances, the way conversations hushed when she passed, only to erupt in mocking whispers once she was out of earshot. For most guests, she wasn't even human, just another servant among the staff ensuring their glasses stayed full and their comfort unbroken. But for Amara, nights like this were heavier than others. The weight wasn't only from the trays she carried but from the silence she was forced to keep, even when laughter and arrogance burned through her like fire. Near the front of the hall stood a grand piano, its black surface gleaming under the lights, untouched for the night. The orchestra provided all the music needed, so the instrument remained more a decoration than a voice. Yet for Amara, each time she passed it, her chest tightened. That piano was no ornament to her. It was a reminder of who she truly was before life pushed her into shadows, an echo of a talent she had buried, locked away beneath years of servitude and prejudice. The irony was cruel. These people, who mocked her existence, would never imagine that the quiet maid moving silently between them had once trained her fingers to dance across ivory keys, creating melodies so haunting that her small church choir used to pause just to listen. But in this mansion, in this gilded hall, her music had no place. Or so it seemed. Because fate has a way of turning silence into thunder, and before the night ended, every arrogant laugh in that room would be replaced by stunned silence, when the maid dared to sit at the piano. The mansion glittered with chandeliers that night, their golden glow reflecting off polished marble floors and gilded mirrors. It was not just another party, it was a gathering of the city's most powerful. Wealthy industrialists, politicians, and high society elites filled the ballroom, sipping champagne and whispering behind jeweled fans. Their laughter carried the arrogance of people who believed themselves untouchable. Amidst the sea of satin gowns and tailored tuxedos, the staff moved like shadows. Black maids in crisp uniforms served trays of hors d'oeuvres. Waiters carried crystal glasses. So delicately they almost vanished into the background. They were expected to be invisible, to work silently while their employers basked in wealth and privilege. Among them was Clara, a young black maid who had been working in the mansion for less than a year. She was diligent, soft-spoken, and obedient, qualities the head of staff praised in her. But tonight, as the laughter and music filled the air, something inside her stirred. Every time she passed the grand piano, an instrument gleaming in the corner like an ornament rather than a source of music, her eyes lingered. Just a moment too long. The guests noticed her glances, and soon, whispers began. A few smirks spread among the crowd. "Look at her," one woman muttered, her diamond necklace glittering as she leaned toward her companion. "She thinks she belongs here." No, she's just staring at the piano. Probably never touched one in her life. The remarks grew bolder, dripping with mockery. For these elites, it was entertainment to find someone beneath them and laugh. And tonight, Clara was their chosen target. It began when the host's son, an arrogant young man desperate to impress his father, raised his voice above the room. He gestured toward Clara with a smirk. "If she loves the piano so much, perhaps she should play for us," he announced. Laughter erupted, sharp and cruel. Clara froze, the tray in her hands trembling slightly. Her eyes darted to the floor, heat rising in her cheeks. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into the shadows like the others. But the crowd wasn't going to let her go. "Go on, girl," someone jeered. "Yes, let's see if she can even find the right keys." The taunting echoed, each laugh louder than the last. It was no longer a suggestion, it was a demand. The head of staff gave her a warning look, one that said, "Endure this humiliation, keep your job." But inside Clara's chest, her heart beat differently. For years, she had hidden a truth from the world. She was not just a maid. She had been a pianist, a gifted one, the daughter of a music teacher who once believed her talent could take her anywhere. But when tragedy struck her family, and life forced her into servitude. The piano became nothing more than a memory. Now, standing in the grand ballroom with dozens of eyes mocking her, Clara faced a choice. She could bow her head, avoid further humiliation, and retreat into silence. Or, she could step forward and let them hear what they never expected. The silence after the laughter was suffocating. The room seemed to lean toward her, waiting, hungry for her shame. Clara placed the tray down on a nearby table and walked slowly toward the piano. Every step echoed. The laughter had died, replaced with murmurs of anticipation. She sat, her fingers trembling above the keys. The weight of the moment pressed down like 1,000 storms. She could feel the disdain in their stares, the disbelief that someone like her could belong at this polished instrument. Then, she pressed the first note. It was soft, fragile, like a whisper in a storm. But it rang clear. And as her hands moved, memory returned. Years of hidden practice, of stolen moments at church pianos and abandoned instruments, poured through her fingers. The sound swelled, filling the cavernous room with something no one expected: beauty. The crowd stilled. Their mocking smiles froze, replaced by something else entirely. But Clara wasn't playing for them. She was playing for herself, for every dream denied, for every insult endured, for every hidden part of her soul they thought they had buried. And as the melody soared, every guest knew this night would not end the way they imagined. The first few notes drifted into the air like falling feathers. But quickly, they grew. What began as a delicate melody blossomed into a storm of music, powerful, precise, and impossibly graceful. Clara's fingers danced across the ivory keys with a confidence that silenced every whisper, every smirk, every cruel thought in the room. The ballroom, once a hive of chatter and laughter, grew eerily still. Guests who had raised glasses of champagne let them hang midair, untouched. Others froze in their seats, eyes wide, as though afraid even the smallest movement would break the spell Clara was casting. The chandelier light seemed to shimmer brighter with each chord, reflecting off crystal and gold, wrapping the entire room in sound. The notes weren't random, they told a story. They carried sorrow, strength, loss, and resilience. The audience could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. And in that moment, Clara was no longer a maid in uniform. She wasn't the girl mocked for daring to look at the piano. She was a master, a storyteller, commanding the air with nothing more than her hands. The guests were stunned. Some leaned forward, their mouths open. Others glanced nervously at one another, unsure of what they were witnessing. The host's son, the one who had started the humiliation, shifted uncomfortably, his arrogance crumbling with every note. The irony was inescapable. The woman they had mocked, the servant they thought unworthy, was revealing a skill none of them possessed. And worse, she was extraordinary. Clara's music surged higher, the tempo quickening as if releasing years of pain and silence. The sorrow in her melody gave way to defiance. Every keystroke felt like a challenge, a declaration that she was more than the role forced upon her. It wasn't just music anymore, it was truth. And the truth burned. A few guests tried to cover their discomfort with nervous laughter, but even that died quickly. There was no escaping what they were seeing. This wasn't a maid fumbling at the piano to amuse them. This was genius, raw and undeniable. One woman, who had earlier whispered mockery into her champagne glass, now had tears welling in her eyes. She didn't know why. The music had found something buried deep within her, a memory, a regret, and dragged it to the surface. The host himself, a man of wealth and pride, sat stiffly in his chair, his face pale. He had spent fortunes on entertainers, hired world-class musicians for his parties. Yet never, never had he heard the piano sing this way. And still, Clara played on. Her body leaned into the instrument, her eyes half closed, her entire being consumed by the performance. It was as though the piano had been waiting for her all along, silent and ornamental until the right hand set it free. When the final note came, it didn't crash like thunder. It faded, soft and lingering, echoing through the silence until even the chandeliers seemed to stop shimmering. Clara sat still, her hands resting gently on the keys. She didn't bow. She didn't look up for approval. She simply breathed, her chest rising and falling as though she had poured her very soul into the instrument. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. It stretched on and on. Every second a reminder of the shame that now belonged not to Clara, but to the people who had tried to humiliate her. And then, someone clapped. Just one pair of hands, sharp and steady. Others followed hesitantly. And then, like a dam breaking, the entire room erupted into thunderous applause. But beneath the applause was something deeper. A realization. A reckoning. For the first time, the powerful in that room saw Clara not as a maid. Not as someone beneath them, but as someone they could never match. And for many of them, that truth was more terrifying than anything else. The applause roared like thunder, but Clara barely moved. She sat still at the piano, her hands resting gently on the keys, her face calm, almost detached, as though the outpouring of admiration around her wasn't meant for her at all. For Clara, the music had never been about them. It had been for herself, for her mother who once sang lullabies in a voice sweet as honey, for her father who hummed hymns while fixing broken chairs, for the little girl inside her who had always believed she was meant for more. Yet the irony was impossible to ignore. These same people who had laughed minutes earlier were now on their feet, clapping until their palms reddened, desperate to be part of the moment they had once tried to deny her. But admiration did not erase what they had done. Clara finally lifted her gaze. Her eyes, dark and steady, swept across the ballroom. The faces staring back at her were filled with awe, embarrassment, even shame. It was as if the chandelier's light had grown harsher, exposing them for what they were. The mocking smirks, the cruel chuckles, the careless words, they could never be taken back. And Clara knew it. The host's son, the arrogant young man who had first sneered at her, looked utterly undone. His jaw clenched, his shoulders tight, his earlier confidence drained away. He could not meet her eyes. Every cheer, every clap, only deepened his humiliation. This was not how the night was supposed to end. He had intended to showcase his power, to remind everyone that he stood above her. But now, everyone knew the truth. It was Clara who stood above him. The host, too, shifted uneasily in his seat. He had built his reputation on grandeur, on being untouchable, on surrounding himself with wealth and culture. Yet here was his own maid, a young black woman, who had outshone every expensive entertainer he had ever paraded before his guests. He looked as though the ground beneath him had cracked. To acknowledge her brilliance would mean admitting he had been blind, small-minded, and cruel. To ignore it would make him look even weaker. The guests were caught in between. Some clapped out of genuine awe, their hearts still pounding from the storm of emotion Clara's music had unleashed. Others clapped because they were too ashamed not to, terrified of being seen as part of the cruelty that had started the humiliation. A few even forced smiles, as if pretending they had supported her all along. Clara rose slowly from the bench, her back straight, her chin lifted. She did not bow. She did not smile. She simply stood there, silent, and the applause faltered. The guests realized they were not cheering for someone grateful for their approval. They were cheering for someone who didn't need it. The silence that followed cut deeper than the performance itself. Clara was no longer just the maid in the corner. She had become something untouchable, someone who had revealed the truth about every single person in that room. And the truth was this: it was never she who had been small. It was them. The shame lingered like smoke in the air. Some guests turned away, suddenly desperate for conversation, anything to escape the weight of what they had just felt. Others whispered to each other, their voices trembling, their eyes darting nervously toward Clara, as though she had stripped away their pretenses. But there was no escaping it. Clara had played the piano. Clara had silenced the room. Clara had shown them who truly held power. And now, nothing, not their wealth, not their arrogance, not their laughter, could erase it. The silence after the storm felt heavier than the music itself. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. Clara stood at the piano, her posture calm, her face unreadable, while the ballroom glittered with chandeliers and gilt. Then, slowly, she stepped back, not toward the center of the room where the elite usually basked in attention, but toward the edges, back to the shadows where she had always been pushed. It was not defeat. It was deliberate. She was showing them she had never needed their light to shine. But just as she turned, the host's father, an old man rarely seen at gatherings anymore, rose from his seat. His cane tapped against the marble floor, his frail body swaying. But his voice cut through the air like a blade. "I know that song," he whispered, loud enough for the room to hear. Every head turned. The old man's eyes glistened. "My wife, she played it. The last time I heard it was decades ago, before she passed. How could you know it?" Clara froze. Her chest tightened, her breath catching. She had not meant to reveal this part of herself, but the truth was now unavoidable. Her mother, long gone, had been more than just a maid. She had once been a pianist in Europe, a hidden star whose music had never reached the grand stages, because her skin had kept her out. When life forced her into labor and silence, she passed the melodies to Clara, teaching her in whispers and shadows. Clara had carried that music like an heirloom, and tonight she had set it free. The old man's voice trembled. You are her daughter." The ballroom gasped. The weight of the revelation crashed over the guests like a wave. The laughter they had once thrown at her, the arrogance that had reduced her to nothing, suddenly looked monstrous. They hadn't been mocking just a maid. They had been mocking the heir to a legacy, a living connection to art and history they had all pretended to revere. The host's son looked pale, his smugness dissolved into shame. The host himself clutched his chair, his face red with a humiliation far deeper than before. For years, he had boasted about culture, refinement, and heritage, only to discover that the very woman scrubbing his floors had embodied more of it than his entire lineage. And the guests? They shifted uncomfortably, their expensive jewelry suddenly feeling like chains, their champagne bitter in their throats. But Clara didn't linger. She offered no explanations, no claims, no vengeance. She simply placed her hands gently on the piano one last time, whispering a final note into the air. It was soft, fragile, yet so piercing that it carried a final message none could mistake. "You tried to bury me, but I was always more than you imagined." Then she walked out. The ballroom never recovered. 4 years afterward, whispers of that night circulated like a legend. They spoke of the black maid who had silenced a room of the wealthy, who had humbled the arrogant, who had played a song that carried both history and defiance. Some guests lied to themselves, retelling the story as though they had supported her all along. Others avoided it entirely, unable to face their shame. But none could forget the way the room had felt when she touched the keys, the way the chandeliers seemed dimmer compared to her. And Clara. She did not return to that mansion. She never needed to. The world beyond its gilded walls was vast, and for the first time, she knew it belonged to her too. She would carry her music forward, not as a maid, not as a shadow, but as herself. The night had not only changed how others saw her, it had changed how she saw herself. For the first time in her life, Clara was free.